some oral vaccine is the vaccine is delivering in some way or other a tiny part of the germ that we're trying to get protection against. And that little tiny part of the germ that is being delivered by the vaccine allows your natural immune system to build defenses that are specific to that part of the germ, so that in the future, if you encounter exposure to that germ, your body already has an army of defenses that fully recognizes that particular pathogen and can fight it right away. So all vaccines work in that same way. The difference how different vaccines work is what strategy the vaccine uses for delivering a tiny part of the germ that we're protect against. And so we use the word platforms. We might have heard that in some of the language that scientists use. There are vaccines of different platforms. And what that just means is there are different approaches it uses for how it's delivering that germ.
Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. So we often hear that analogy, and you used it as well, sort of training the troops or training the soldiers. And you can almost imagine like these troops getting into shape and being ready for a potential foreign agent in a way, and being trained up and ready to combat it. I mean, I know that's really simplifying it, but that's essentially what we're saying, right?
That's exactly it. Actually, it's not that far off, the analogy. If you're playing in a team sport.
Oh, we've lost. There she is. We just so you know, Dr. O'Brien's connectivity is not great today, so she might drop off and come back. But here she is again, and we'll just soldier on.
We'll just soldier on. I'm sure we've all had this experience. You can't imagine why suddenly your internet isn't working very well. It's kind of like, if everybody has played some kind of team sport. If we didn't have jerseys on that said, I'm on the blue team, you're on the red team, if we were just regular clothes, you wouldn't be able to recognize who is your opponent and who's on. And so that's exactly what the immune system has to do. It has to recognize that this germ it's seeing is actually one of the germs to fight against. It doesn't want to wait until you actually get disease from a germ to say, oops, that was one of the harmful germs and I should have attacked it. So what a vaccine does is it's training the immune system to say, when you see this again, that's one of those germs that we want you to attack. So that's how vaccines work, is they train your own natural immune system to recognize the germ that we want you to be protected against.
And we're using the term germ very casually. I mean, it's certainly not what you talk about when you're in your scientific meetings, but we're using it as a casual term to mean the pathogen that we're concerned about. It makes headline news these days if somebody has been vaccinated and yet gets sick. So people are surprised. The assumption is that if you've been vaccinated against COVID, it should not be possible to catch the disease at all. So that's one of the things we wanted to discuss today. Dr. O'Brien, can you explain why it is possible or first of all, is it? And if so, why is it possible for someone to catch the disease, as it were, even after they've been fully vaccinated?
Yeah, another great question, and something we're really hearing a lot in questions that we're getting. So there's no vaccine that is 100% protective in 100% of the people who get the vaccine. So we do expect that there will be a small number of cases that will occur in people who were vaccinated. Now, why is it those particular people? Why did this person get disease, but another person didn't get disease when they got exposed? And there are a number of reasons why there might be what we call breakthrough infections. Another way of referring to it is the vaccine didn't protect in the full way that we wanted it to. So some of the reasons why somebody might get ill and somebody else might not, it have to do with how much exposure the person had to the pathogen. Sometimes you might be exposed to the pathogen, but you only get a small dose of the pathogen, have a consistent exposure to the pathogen, and you're getting a very heavy dose of the pathogen. So that's one of the elements that can determine whether or not you're going to maybe have a breakthrough infection. But the other point about the vaccines that we're finding, even if you have a breakthrough infection, even if you get sick, in spite of the fact that you're fully vaccinated, the severity of these is much reduced. So there is benefit from vaccine, not only to protect you fully from, getting or not getting disease, but even if you're one of the rare individuals who does get sick in spite of having been fully vaccinated, the likelihood that you will have severe disease is much lower. So those are the two ways in which vaccines can benefit. And I think it's important for people to realize there's almost nothing in our lives that is 100% certain, as of course is the phrase about taxes. This is these are biological products, and we don't 100% certainty in 100% of the people. But these are vaccines that are really effective. The vast majority of people are protected from disease and have incredible benefit from being vaccinated.
Just to note, today, when we're talking about the vaccines and the ones that we are saying are very effective, we're talking about the vaccines that WHO has been able to review and has provided emergency use listing for, therefore sort of telling the governments who want our okay that these vaccines are okay. That's right, Kate. So we're not speaking about every vaccine that's out there because we don't have the detail of every vaccine, but we have the detail of the ones we were able to review.
Yeah, there are about 17 vaccines that are in use around the world now. At WHO, we are very comfortable to speak about the vaccines that we've had a chance, an opportunity to see the data on. And those data are on both the safety, the effectiveness of the vaccine, and also on the quality of the manufacturing. There's a difference between a vaccine that can work in people and being able to produce that vaccine in tens of millions or hundreds of millions of doses, where every dose is exactly the same as the dose prior to it and after it, and is assured to have the characteristics of the vaccines that were tested in clinical trials. And so there are 6 vaccines that we've seen the data on. We've looked at the manufacturing processes, and it is that process that leads to WHO giving its moniker of emergency use listing. It means we've seen the data, and we are verifying that the data and the manufacturing processes meet the highest international standards. It's difficult for us to comment on any vaccines that we've not had the opportunity to review, and that's the choice of manufacturers about whether they will submit their data to WHO for review. So we are encouraging every manufacturer of a product to work with us so that we can look at those data and provide that confidence to governments and people around the world, and be able to speak about the vaccines that are available.
I just want to say thank you to all the people who are popping in the chat and telling us where they're listening from. We'll recap that at the end. There's a question from Facebook, and this goes back to what we were discussing off the top. Can vaccinated people still end up in hospital?
Sure. So just reinforcing this, getting your full course of vaccine. So most of the vaccines now are 2-dose vaccines. The Janssen vaccine, also known as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is a 1-dose vaccine, but we'll mostly speak about 2 doses with this one exception. So getting 2 doses is going to give you very high protection against severe disease, against hospitalization, and against death. But none of these vaccines, I'll just say again, none of them are 100% protective in 100% of people. So one of the important points is, especially as vaccines are continuing to be rolled out in your community, in your country, and around the world, it's really important that we maintain some of those other interventions that reduce the likelihood that you're going to get exposed to the virus or that even if you are infected and you don't know it, that you would pass it on to somebody else. So while the vaccines are being rolled out, we give the vaccines the very best chance to work and to have an impact both in your family and in your community, and of course in you, as long as we're keeping the transmission quite low while the vaccines are being rolled out. So that's the reason why we're continuing to emphasize that eventually we're going to be providing recommendations about releasing some of these non-vaccine and non-pharmaceutical interventions, all the physical things that we've been doing. But now is not the time to be doing that, especially in communities that are still at the beginning of the vaccine rollout.
I think some people are a little bit frustrated. You're talking about all the measures people have been asked to do for all this time. Wearing a mask if you're indoors, trying to avoid crowded places, ensuring good ventilation, opening a window, meeting people outside if you can, regular hand washing, all of these things. And we're saying that while transmission is still ongoing in your community, whether or not you've been vaccinated, do continue those measures to help bring to help until transmission goes down, until you and more people are vaccinated as well. But I think people can be a little bit frustrated at that because they think, well, I got vaccinated precisely so that I could stop doing all these things. And we like to remind people that you get vaccinated in order to protect yourself from falling ill and to reduce how much you can pass on the vaccine. Is that a good summary?
It's a really good summary.
Pass on the virus.
Listen, what I would say is we're all tired of these interventions. So I wear glasses just like Nika, you're wearing glasses. And I'll tell you, have never figured out how to make my glasses stop getting fogged up while I'm wearing a mask. I can't wait to stop wearing a mask, but now is not the time. We are so close. We've got these amazing vaccines right now. And the effort of everybody to see through to the end of this, which is as the vaccines are getting rolled out, the lower the chance that you're going to be exposed to the virus. And especially if you're vaccinated, the likelihood of getting infected is lower than if you weren't vaccinated, but it's not zero. And we know that you can pass on this virus without even having any symptoms. So you're wearing the mask and you're doing those other things, not only to protect yourself, even though you're vaccinated, the likelihood you're going to get seriously ill or hospitalized, heaven forbid, die from COVID is drastically lower than vaccinated. But the vaccines don't work as well against protecting against just infection without disease or getting to somebody else. There is some effect of the vaccines, but they don't work as well against those low symptomatology, less symptom kind of states. So you're also people around you who may not have been able to get vaccinated yet by continuing to wear masks, hand washing, distancing, meeting outside. And we are going to get to a place where we don't have to do these anymore, but we're really challenging the vaccine program if we lift these things too early, and we're just going to end up back where we were a couple of months ago if we're impatient around these interventions. We really want to get people back in school. We want to get companies working. We want to get businesses operating. And as long as we can do these relatively simple, although annoying things, we're not going to be in this forever. People need to get vaccinated. The vaccines need to roll out. We need the coverage to increase in communities, and we will get there. Now is not the time.
Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions about combining doses from one vaccine or another, and some countries are doing that as well. What's WHO's view on combining, getting a first dose of one vaccine and a second dose of another one?
Yeah, we really want to get to that point because, as I said, there's a lot of vaccines out there now. There's 17 vaccines, more are coming. And the optimal place to be is that any of these vaccines can be mixed and matched. And that's the way we refer to it, as mix and matching of vaccines. We don't have the data yet. This is part of the research that is ongoing research and will continue to come in. We do have data on one of the mix and match schedules, and that's if you've gotten an AstraZeneca vaccine first and then second get a Pfizer vaccine, we have really pretty good data that that will work. So we do have what's called a permissive recommendation that if you've been vaccinated with AstraZeneca first, it's okay to go ahead and get a Pfizer vaccine if that's the thing that's offered to you as your second dose. Apart from that, we don't have data yet on whether there are any safety considerations and whether the immune response to those mix and match schedules are compromised in any way. It's possible, and there are theoretical reasons why some of the mix and match schedules actually might be a better immune response than if you got the same vaccine twice. Those studies are underway, and we're expecting to be able to have those data in the coming months. So we'll have a lot more information about being able to do mix and match schedules. At the current time, we still recommend that for vaccines that need a 2-dose schedule, that you get the same vaccine for both doses.
Thanks for that. We have a question on what WHO's recommendation is for someone who's had COVID, they've had the disease, they've recovered. Do they still need to be vaccinated if they have the opportunity to get the vaccine?
Yeah, there are two sort of ways to think about this. The first is that if you've had COVID, we also know that there is a period of time when you have quite a bit of protection against getting sick again. Again, it's not 100%, but like vaccine-induced immunity, naturally induced immunity does provide you with some level of protection for 6 months, and we're continuing to follow to see just how long that immunity lasts. So one way that we've thought about this and our recommendation is if you know that you've had COVID, and if you're living in a setting where there's quite a shortage of vaccines, you might choose out of an altruistic sense to let some go first because you have a period of relative protection. So you might defer getting your vaccine out of a generosity to have somebody else who might be in more need first. But then the second question is, how many doses of vaccine do you need? And we do now have some growing evidence that for those people who have had COVID disease previously, the response even to a single dose of vaccine is strong and might be an adequate response and not need to get the second dose. There are a couple of problems with that. That may be true for people who know for sure that they've had COVID disease. And if that is a confirmed situation, getting a single dose is probably okay. The problem is we don't want immunization programs to now put a hurdle in place and say, we're going to be testing people for COVID to see if you've had COVID before, and then we're going to decide how many doses you're going to get. So from a program perspective, our recommendation is that regardless of your history of COVID disease, you should get the number of doses that are recommended regardless of whether you've had disease or not. So there's a little bit of nuance to that. We do recommend people get their full course of vaccine, but for those who have a fully documented, clear case of COVID, limiting the dose for that primary part is probably okay.
Okay. And then when does the immunity kick in? Let's say we're talking about a two-dose vaccine regimen. When can you feel like your soldiers are ready for battle? When are you ready to battle, basically?
So for all the vaccines that are 2-dose vaccines and for the 1-dose Janssen vaccine, we're recommending that weeks following the dose in whatever the schedule is when you have sort of your full protection that you're going to get from that vaccine. So we do recommend a 2-week interval as the point in time when you say, okay, this vaccine has done what it's going to do, and you have the level of protection that you're going to have.
And how long will that protection last?
Well, we wish we knew the answer to that question, and that's research that, again, is ongoing. I think it's important for people to remember that these vaccines were only in development about a year ago. And so these people that received these vaccines were only those who had been vaccinated about a year ago, and then more people have been vaccinated. Remember, the programs to actually immunize the general public only began in a very limited number of countries in December of 2020, and most of the vaccines have been rolling out in the spring of 2021. So we just need time to be able to monitor people who have received vaccines, especially those people, some of the first to get them because they've sort of got a head start in terms of monitoring time. And we'll be looking vaccine by vaccine around both the persistence of immunity, but you don't necessarily have to have immunity that you can measure in your blood. Part of the way that vaccines work is that they train the cells that produce antibodies. And so your cells may still have that memory and that training to quickly produce antibodies. And we're learning more and more about whether there are measurements from testing your blood that can predict whether you're still immune, or really are we just looking at the information about in a kind of collective way, how long do the vaccines last at a population level. So we're still watching this and making no conclusions yet about the duration of immunity.
I find that really interesting, what we were saying at the beginning. We don't know long term because we're not in long term. We don't know how long this lasts because we are all in the experience of getting vaccinated and seeing how long it lasts. Although I should make a sidebar, and this is a really important message from WHO. Those of us who are lucky enough to live in a country where there have been vaccines are able to talk about this. However, there's many countries in the world where there have been few vaccines. Can you talk us about, because you're very much involved in this effort as well, what WHO is doing to help more vaccines reach more people in more countries?
Yeah, this program is not where it needs to be from a deployment of vaccines. We have almost 3 billion doses of vaccine that have been administered around the world. However, the deployment of those vaccines is really uneven across countries. So countries that are low-income countries have deployed about 1.5 doses for every 100 people in the population, and that compares with over 70 doses for every 100 people in the population in high-income countries. So we have an alarm bell ringing, and we have an urgency to take action for those countries that have secured a lot of doses and are very far along in their immunization program. It's essential and urgent that they share those doses with the rest of the world. Now, we do have a global mechanism called the COVAX facility, which has purchased vaccines in order to deploy them to low-income countries and low-middle-income countries that are in need of these vaccines. So there are 92 countries that benefit from the COVAX facility donation of vaccines. And the facility has secured enough doses to immunize upwards of about 30%, almost 30% of the populations in those countries. But the issue is, when are the doses going to be made available? And that's the difficult situation that we're in right now, is that some of the suppliers have had difficulty making enough vaccine the way they had expected to be able to make the vaccine. We've also had supply that has not been able to be shipped out to the countries it was intended for because the country that is making the vaccine is in a crisis themselves in the pandemic. And we've also had situations where the timing of when those doses were committed to be made available, there's an order of which country is going to go first, second, and third. So we're calling on all countries that have a lot of vaccine to do several things. First of all, to start donating some of their vaccine to the COVAX facility. The second is informing the manufacturers that they're willing to wait on some of their shipments in lieu of the COVAX facility being able to go more quickly. We're also asking all manufacturers to come to WHO to get listed under emergency use listing, because the vaccines that go into the COVAX facility have to have either WHO emergency use listing or on an exceptional basis, some of the stringent regulatory authorities around the world. But it really is about WHO emergency use listing. So there are active things that countries that have high access to vaccine can do right now to make sure that vaccines are being deployed with much greater equity. And we have a lot of donated doses, but we really need those doses deployed immediately through the COVAX facility.
Thanks for that update on COVAX. There's a number of questions on gap between doses. So how long should you wait, or what's the ideal length of time between getting your first dose and your second dose?
Yeah, so this is what we call the interval. The interval between, as you say, how many weeks between, or how many days or how many weeks between your first dose and your second dose. So each of the vaccines was tested using a specific interval, and there's a range around that interval. So without going through vaccine by vaccine, in general, the interval is somewhere between 3 weeks and upwards of 12 weeks. Most vaccines work better if the second dose is given with a longer interval. But it also means that if that first dose is not giving you substantial protection, you don't want a prolonged period where you've only had one dose and you only have limited protection. So there's kind of this trade-off between how long to wait and still be at risk of disease, and not wanting to shorten that too short because the second dose has a better impact, generally speaking, when given in a longer interval. So for example, the AstraZeneca vaccine, we're recommending that that's a vaccine that be given in a 6 to 12 week interval or an 8 to 12 week interval. For some of the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna vaccine and Pfizer, we recommend at a 21-day to 28-day interval, the Moderna vaccine at a 28-day interval. So on average, it's approximately 4 weeks, and each vaccine has a specific recommendation. The most important thing, and it's over and above exactly what this interval is, the most important thing is to get the second dose. And that's especially true with the variants that are circulating now, that for some of the vaccines, it's really important to get the second dose because the first dose doesn't have any substantial protection against some of the variants. So all of the vaccines are working against the variants, but it's really important to get that second dose.
Just a reminder to everyone, this is a WHO live Q&A on the effectiveness of COVID-19 vaccines. And we have with us Dr. Kate O'Brien, who's the director of WHO's Department of Immunization, Vaccines, and Biologicals. There's several questions as well on children and vaccines. What's WHO's recommendation on whether or not kids should get vaccinated?
Oh, another great question. So there's only one vaccine at this point that is registered for use in children under 12 years of age. Most of the vaccines are not registered for broad age groups in the childhood period. Those studies are ongoing, and we do expect that the manufacturers are going to come with data that would support that the vaccines are safe and effective in younger children. So that's the issue around whether they're authorized for use in young children at this point. But the second point is whether they should be used. There are a couple things I want to say about this. We are in a stage, when I just commented on this, where those people who are the highest priority groups, the health workers, those who are older adults, in other words, those people who are at highest risk of severe disease, of hospitalization, and of death, have largely not been vaccinated yet in low-income and low-middle-income countries. So millions and millions of people who are the highest priority people to be vaccinated. And so children have a very low risk of having disease of any meaningful severity. That's not to say it's impossible for that to happen, but it's very unusual to see a severe disease episode in children, and certainly extremely unusual to see something severe enough to result in serious disease or death. So now is not the time to be using the constrained supply that the world has to be vaccinating these very low risk populations. And the reason perhaps to vaccinate children, but we're still learning about this, is what part of transmission are children playing a role in? You know, it's interesting because most respiratory viruses, children are one of the groups that are the major cause of transmission. They have runny noses, their hand hygiene, their nose hygiene isn't great, they cough and sneeze on other people. But curiously, for COVID, they seem to play a much smaller role in transmission, definitely have a much lower risk of disease, as I've mentioned already. So while we are in a situation where there isn't enough vaccine yet to vaccinate everybody in the world, deploying the precious resource that we have for these lowest risk groups, children, is just not the time to be doing that. The vaccines should be used to protect those who most need those vaccines. And we will get to the point where we'll be able to better assess whether there's a compelling reason to vaccinate children. And then adolescents is another category. Adolescents do play a larger role in transmission. And I want to specifically emphasize the issue of going back to school. The reason why we might think about vaccinating children for the of going back to school is really to protect the adults around them. And if the adults around them themselves are vaccinated, we don't need to be prioritizing children in order for them to be at school. They're not major transmitters, and they're not the ones who are going to be getting sick. So children should be in school. The adults who are essential for the welfare and the schooling of children should be vaccinated so they feel safe in their work environment. But the approach to this is not to start deploying the precious vaccines we have among children.
WHO, UNICEF, and UNESCO, some of our sister UN agencies, UNICEF, of course, being in charge of children, and UNESCO on culture and education. We have joint guidance on how schools can be opened safely, what kind of measures can be put in place to ensure that kids, especially the young kids, are getting the education and all the other come from being in school. So that's reinforcing some of what you were saying, Dr. O'Brien. We have another question here. So many vaccines. You mentioned that there were 17 vaccines in use, 6 of which have WHO approval. So there's so many vaccines. How do you make a clear conclusion on which vaccine should be the best? Is it okay to take whichever one is available?
What we recommend, so again, we speak about the vaccines for which there has been emergency use listing, but our general message is the best vaccine to get is the one that you've been offered. We certainly do here in some countries that are very fortunate to have a lot of doses and a number of different products that people are getting particular about comparing, the data from clinical trials about this vaccine and that vaccine. The vaccines that are emergency use listed by WHO are all vaccines that have met the criteria that have been set out before the vaccines were developed about what kind of impact a vaccine would need to have in order for it to be a really useful vaccine for addressing the panic. So for those vaccines, whichever one you're offered is the one that is first available and is accessible to you, that's the vaccine that you should get. You know, I wanted to mention something else. I saw a comment in the chat that I just want to clear up. I was commenting about the importance of the donations of doses from high-income countries that have a lot of doses. Some countries have signed agreements that are enough doses to vaccinate their population multiple times over. And I just want to clarify that donations are really donations that come through the manufacturer. So the quality of the vaccines is assured. They have not been shipped yet for use in the countries that have bought the vaccines. They're coming from the manufacturer. It's just that the country is releasing those doses from the manufacturer to be deployed into another country. So I just wanted to clarify that. It's not It's not like going to a secondhand clothes store or something like that. These are full secure doses that are part of the donation.
So it's like the country had a deal with that manufacturer. They no longer want to take their option on those vaccines. Someone else can, or they're giving their option on that vaccine to someone else in a way. And it's also not vaccine that's left the manufacturer, been in a truck, been in an airplane, been in a truck, been in a refrigerator, been back on a truck, and so on. Is that what you're trying to clear up?
That's right. They're coming directly from the manufacturer.
All right. Let me see here, just pulling up my questions here. Do you think we might have to vaccinate again some years down the line or a year down the line? What are we thinking? I mean, we're not in the long term yet, so we don't have that concrete answer. But what is WHO thinking about? What are you discussing with colleagues? What are you weighing in order to have a sense of whether or not we think some kind of a booster will be needed or a second shot? There's different types of vaccination where you need repeated shots. We know that people get the flu vaccine every year because the circulating flu virus changes. So what's WHO thinking of and looking at, and how do you start to formulate an answer to that question on whether or not we will need follow-up shots of some sort?
Yeah, really important. We're working along two streams here. One is to make sure that the evidence is available to make this decision. We don't want to be in a position where a decision has to be made about whether to give booster doses and we're not sure about it. In other words, if we start to give booster doses and we don't know whether it was really necessary, we're essentially buying or committing to a strategy for years forward in time. So it's really important that any decisions about the need for booster doses is based on data and based on evidence. So that's one stream, the scientific stream that we're working on. But while that evidence is in motion, is being collected, we have to be ready in case the answer to that question is yes, booster doses are needed. We don't know if that's what the answer is going to be, but we definitely don't want to be in a position from a worldwide perspective that if it's possible that's the answer, that we're starting flat-footed and only then communicating to the manufacturers that we need more doses produced. Doses can't be produced in an ever-increasing number of doses in a very short time frame. So the other stream of work is to be estimating how much supply would be needed if the answer is that booster doses are needed, either for people who are at most risk of disease. For instance, perhaps booster doses might be necessary only for older adults and those with underlying conditions. Perhaps for younger people, the intensity and duration of immunity would be stronger and longer. So those are some of the issues that we'll be looking at scientifically, but at the same time, we want to make sure that those investments have been made with the manufacturers and an option to buy those doses should they be necessary. So we're working in two streams here of both the evidence and trying to figure out when we would know and when those investments would have to be made with an option to procure the vaccines.
I think that's something people might not realize, that a lot of work goes on. I mean, most of the work goes on behind the scenes, but there's a lot of work that we don't necessarily talk about. It's not terribly interesting, but even for the rollout of these vaccines, we were working with countries ahead of time to say, this is what might be coming. This is how you probably should prepare. Is your regulatory body ready to approve new vaccines and so on? So that's a lot of what WHO's job is to help countries prepare ahead of time. I want to clarify something as well, and I know this came up at the press conference a couple of weeks ago. For those of you who are interested, you can always watch our press conferences. They're streamed on Twitter and YouTube and so on. People are a little bit confused because when we use language like emergency use listing, it sounds like this is an emergency vaccine, or this is a temporary vaccine, or perhaps still experimental vaccines. So can you just explain what kind of process? I mean, it could take a long time, but just quickly explain the status of these vaccines that WHO has emergency use listed, and just clarify that these are not experimental vaccines at this stage.
Sure. So experimental vaccines are vaccines that have not yet had sufficient evidence to make a recommendation and to authorize their use. Um, the vaccines that we're talking about in the countries around the world and for WHO have this term. It's either emergency use authorization or emergency use listing. And the intent of this was to allow for vaccines that have demonstrated that they are safe, that they are immunogenic, and that they are effective against preventing disease, which is the whole intention of a vaccine. Those are the pieces of evidence that have to be available, along with the quality of manufacturing, in order to be authorized for use by a regulatory authority in the country. An example of that would be for the Europeans. They've come together and they use the European Medicines Agency. In the US, it's the FDA. So there are regulators in every country. And those regulators require this level of evidence in order to authorize that the vaccines can be used outside of experimental use. What these vaccines haven't had is they haven't had long-term use. And we know that. This is what an emergence listing is there is an emergency, and we don't have the luxury of long-term use in clinical trials before deciding that the benefit and the risk of using them is far outweighed on the side of the benefit. So that's what emergency use listing is. It does all of these vaccines that have been WHO, meeting the WHO emergency use listing criteria. They've all had extensive safety evaluations done. They've all demonstrated that they prevent disease to the magnitude that was established before the clinical trials started about what would be a meaningful public health benefit and individual benefit. And they've all been evaluated for the quality of their manufacturing. And so more data is collected over time, every day, on these vaccines. And that's one of the requirements of the manufacturers, is that they continue to carefully collect information so that these vaccines have the longer term information and will receive a full authorization and not be categorized in emergency use listed anymore, but would be categorized as being registered. So that's the difference between the two. But I really want to emphasize that no corners have been cut here. It really has to do with the volume of data and the duration of the data.
And just to clarify, as we said off the beginning, no vaccine is 100% effective, but these ones are incredibly effective. The ones we have approved have been in the 94, 95% effectiveness. So that's a very effective vaccine. I have a bit of an odd question, and we didn't chat about this ahead of time, so I hope you're ready for this one. There's a myth. I feel comfortable saying that this is a myth, but you can clarify it. That people who are vaccinated become magnetic, that their arm is magnetic, and you could attract metal to your arm. Does that sound plausible?
So there are a lot of pieces of information out in social media and otherwise, and this is one of those pieces of information that is not it's not accurate. It's not true. There isn't magnetism related to receiving a vaccine. The vaccines, the components that are in a vaccine are predominantly this component that I talked about, which is a small part of the pathogen that we're trying to expose your natural immune system to. And there are other components in vaccines, and depending on which platform it is, those different components vary. But no, there's no truth to that statement that there is a sort of induction of magnetism as a result of becoming vaccinated. It's not an accurate reflection of the vaccines.
Thanks for that. We say often, our Director General says often, that sharing vaccine, ensuring workers, the older people, people with in all countries in the world are protected. So that the global group of vulnerable people are protected. We say that that's the morally right thing to do, but we also say that it's the right thing to do in order to slow down and move us towards ending the pandemic. So can you explain that side of things? You know, what's in it for me, essentially? Why should I care if somebody on the other side of the globe is vaccinated?
Yeah, this pandemic is not going to end as long as there is high transmission going on in substantial parts of the world. And I think the example that we can give here is around countries that have had substantial vaccination and the variants, some of the variants of concern. I mentioned before that the variants are each more highly transmissible than the non-variants. And what we've seen is that some countries are backsliding in terms of the number of cases that they have, in part resulting the variants of concern, which are more transmissible than the non-variants. And where do the variants of concern come from? Well, there are mutations that happen in these viruses all the time. That's not news. So it's not just coronaviruses. All viruses have that occur over time. The point is not that mutations are in. The point is that when there's a lot of transmission happening from person to person, transmission is in part of not yet having full vaccination of the most at-risk people and broad vaccination, especially in the adult parts of the population. It's like taking shots on goal. The more shots on goal you have, the more likely you are to score. The more transmission there is, the more the chance that one of those mutations is going to be a mutation that gives the virus a better chance at survival. And so that's why there can be the emergence of variants that are more highly transmissible. It gives that particular virus a running chance to outcompete other strains of the virus. So this is one of the most important reasons why when we say no country is safe until every country is safe, is that transmission is going to continue unless we have broad vaccination coverage in every country. And while transmission is ongoing in many countries, those variants are spreading across all countries in the world, even in those substantial vaccination already. So that's the reason why it's just not going to work if some countries are going very fast and other countries are lagging behind. It's actually putting all countries at risk.
The more the viruses are able to move around amongst us, the more those natural changes, it's natural for the virus to change, the more those natural changes continue, and the ones that change to be more transmissible transmit more. It's sort of logical in a way. We're about to wrap up, but I just wanted to hear you one more time on this question because it remains confusing for people. Is it still possible to catch the disease after being vaccinated? And if you could put in there some of the statistics we're seeing, because we are seeing some encouraging statistics come back in countries, even ones where they've seen cases going up. There's actually some good news there. So just one more time on that one, please.
Yeah, it's such an important point. So I'm happy to kind of go over it again. The vaccines that are in use, especially the vaccines that are WHO emergency use listed, which are the ones that we can speak about, they are performing based on clinical trials at a level of preventing 80 to 95% of the serious disease, hospitalizations, and deaths. And I'm using some round numbers here. So in the 80%, in the 90%. That's a great number, but it's not 100%. And so it is possible, although very unlikely, that if you are fully vaccinated, it's possible that you can still get disease. But again, I want to emphasize, it is much less likely for you to get disease than if you weren't vaccinated. So the fact that we have some events, some people who are fully vaccinated and nevertheless have unfortunately developed COVID. That's not unexpected. In fact, that happens that happens with all vaccines. There's no vaccine that is 100% protective. I wonder if I can just draw an analogy here. When you go out in a car, you put a seatbelt on. Seatbelts are highly effective at preventing a serious injury if you're in an accident. But it's not 100% protect people who are in a serious car accident and in spite of wearing their seatbelt have a serious injury. That's not a reason not to wear your seatbelt. It's ever more important to wear your seatbelt because the likelihood that that would happen if you were in a car accident is very low. So it's the same story. It's really important to get vaccinated because it gives you a huge amount of protection, but it's not 100%. So the fact that we're hearing about cases of people who were in fact fully vaccinated and happen to get disease is an unusual. It's a low risk that it will happen, but always known that happens, and it happens with all vaccines. So that isn't to lose confidence in the vaccines. We're watching very carefully at the numbers of those cases, and I'll give you one more way to think about this. As the number of people goes up that are vaccinated, when you look at the cases occur, the portion of those cases that will be people who are vaccinated is also going to go up. The number of cases of COVID is going to keep going down, but the fraction of those cases that are vaccinated will appear as a larger and larger number. And then you can think of this in the greatest extreme. If 100% of people were vaccinated, and yet the vaccine is not 100% protective, whatever cases do occur will be people who were vaccinated, but it will be an incredibly small number of cases. And that's what we're really aiming for. We want the fewest number of cases possible because it is that fewest number of cases that allow us to stop using these other measures that we have, the masks, the hand washing, the physical distancing, the not gathering in large groups. That's what we all want to get back to, and we are going to get there. So what is most important right now is to, if you have access to vaccine, to go vaccinated, to continue using those other measures while those around you are getting vaccine. And we will get there together, and we'll be able to safely take off our masks, live a more normal life, and not have risk of our parents or ourselves or other loved ones to end up in hospital or to have serious disease even more than being hospitalized. So we will get there, and we're tired of this, but it's really important that we continue to walk the path towards getting out of this acute pandemic.
Thank you, Dr. O'Brien. And as you're saying, we're walking that path, and we're walking it together. So that's what will get us through to the end. Encouraging your friends and family to keep it up, even as you understand how frustrated and tired they are, because you yourself are as frustrated and tired. I'm just going to wrap up by listing the various countries and places that have been following us today. So you might hear your country: Nepal, India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Zambia, Uganda, Germany, Indonesia, South Africa. On LinkedIn, we had Mali, Germany, Greece, Zambia, Egypt, Uganda, Turkey, Rwanda, USA, Pakistan, India, Kenya, South Africa, Portugal, Tunisia, Brazil, Morocco, UK, Nigeria, France, Zimbabwe. I'm almost done. Ethiopia, Mexico, Haiti, South Africa, Finland, Guinea, Poland, Ghana, Canada, Tanzania, Ireland, and Sierra Leone. Thank you very much for tuning in from wherever you are. Join us for next week, hopefully when we do the next live. Keep your eye on all our social media platforms for the various products we're putting out there. Let us know which ones you like. Let us know what's working. Let us know what questions you have. In fact, it's your questions that help us decide what topics we're going to do our various products on, and our social media events as well. So you really help us know what the questions are, what the needs are, so that we can answer them. So just wanted to thank you again, Dr. Kate O'Brien, our Director of the Department of Immunization, Vaccines, and Biologicals. Thanks for being with us. My name is Nika Alexander. I'm part of the Department of Communications here at WHO, headquarters here in Geneva, Switzerland. Thank you so much. Be safe. We're all in it together, and we'll get through it together. Bye-bye.